me, success is living in complete obedience to Jesus. It's not just looking at it from what external views of success might be, but really more what an internal view of success would be.
God has given each of us special gifts, and it's our job to figure out what they are and where He would have us use them.
One has to trust God because nothing is guaranteed. Even health and the length of our life is not guaranteed.
Impacting the marketplace with our faith, that we demonstrate that faith every day in what we do, how we do it, that it leaves anybody that we do business with. They leave our presence with a desire to grow closer to God.
Hi everyone, my name is Tessa Needham and I'm the Operations Manager for ELO. Welcome to today's ELO webinar, Jesus on Economics and Entrepreneurship, an interview with Jerry Bowyer. The conversation between Rick and Jerry will begin shortly, but before we get started, I'd like to point out a few important parameters for our live conversation today. Throughout the webinar, please submit all of your questions to the Q&A section and not to the chat section. You can find the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to begin submitting questions at any time. We encourage you to use the live chat feature to interact with one another, introduce yourselves, your company, and where you're from. A quick note on that, make sure that when you go to the chat that you're set to send to all attendees and panelists, not just panelists. Rick and Jerry will not be monitoring the chat, so please use it to interact with one another and submit any questions to the Q&A. After the webinar is finished, we do have a quick survey that will pop up. We will be doing a draw in the coming days of everyone who completes the survey to give away 5 copies of Jerry's new book. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and everyone will be sent a follow-up email with a link for the recording. It will also be available on the ELO podcast in the coming week. I would now like to introduce Dr. Rick Goossen, Chairman, Advisory Board, ELO Group, and Strategic Counsel for Nicola Wealth, who will be interviewing Jerry Bowyer and hosting our conversation today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tessa, for those opening remarks. I'm really excited to have Jerry Bowyer with us. He has phenomenal credentials. He is a financial economist, a public speaker at business conferences. He's been a frequent radio and television host, an author, and a journalist. In particular, he's the author of the book, The Maker versus the Takers, What Jesus Really Said About Economics and Social Justice. It's an excellent book, and the link will be made available in the chat function. So please take advantage of that. At this point, I'd welcome Jerry to start your video, and so we can get started. Hey, Jerry.
Hey, Rick, how are you?
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to an excellent conversation. We've had you on sessions in the past, and they've always been extremely informative. And one thing I should mention to people is Jerry will be part of our Entrepreneurial Leaders Program in August. We're expecting it to go forward, subject to COVID protocols, of course, but we're anticipating it'll go forward. Jerry will be an adjunct instructor in our Entrepreneurial Leaders Program at Wycliffe Hall, University of Oxford. So without further ado, let's get started. So Jerry, you're not only a financial economist, but also a lay minister. So you're uniquely qualified to address this opening question. Isn't Jesus against the wealthy and sticks up for the poor? Isn't that obvious? And isn't that what most people think?
Well, that's half right. He clearly does stick up for the poor. maybe I can make it 3/4 right, because he sometimes attacks the wealthy. But to reduce Jesus's message on the wealthy down to a single dimension, the class, the wealthy, is to really ignore the text of the Bible and Jesus's far more nuanced message, which is that Jesus makes distinctions among wealthy people and his denunciations of them. And the pattern is that he treats those who are associated with the creation of wealth, entrepreneurs, builders, farmers, differently than he treats people who are associated with the extraction of wealth, money changers, chief tax collectors, and members of the Sanhedrin, like the rich young ruler. So Jesus is smart. He makes distinctions, which, I think as some theologians interpret them, they're unwilling to make the same distinctions that Jesus is willing to make.
So Jerry, if I could just emphasize that point and have you maybe elaborate on it, because, often when we hear people exposit biblical truths, they'll refer to a rich person or wealth. But of course, as we know, and you being an economist, those are very general terms. So it sounds like what you're saying is, would it be fair to say for Christians who are listening, we need to have, and in fact, Jesus had a nuanced approach to wealth?
Yes, I think that is the right approach. Another way to say that is hermeneutically, as we're interpreting the Bible, details matter. Details are not extraneous. So I think there's a tendency for people to read Jesus's comments really on any topic, including economics, as though it's fortune cookie advice. You crack open a fortune cookie and the fortune cookie says, you are your own worst enemy, right? Well, the person next to you could have cracked open that fortune cookie, right? And it would still be just as applicable, right? Jesus isn't doing that. Jesus knows where he is when he's speaking, and he speaks differently in different places. And why should we think, don't you do that? I don't know a speaker, or at least a decent speaker. I know a lot of people who are on the speaking circuit. And when they go to Indianapolis versus going to Vancouver versus going to London versus going to Paris versus going to Washington, D.C., they vary their message because they know what audience they're in front of. Do we think Jesus does less? He knows when he's in Bethany, and he knows when he's in Bethsaida, and he knows when he's in Judea, Jerusalem, Nazareth, whatever. And each of those different places that he speaks in have different economic bases. They have different industries. There's an industry at Bethlehem, and it's not the same as the industry at Cana. And so those little details, we miss them. Now, if you're telling a story where you say that there's some rabbi and he goes to Wall Street and he starts talking about wealth, and to a very rich person, we kind of know already what the industry is there. Wall Street is finance, or maybe Silicon Valley. We know that the default there will be say technology, for example, in that case, or in Washington, D.C., it's a company town and the company is government. But we just know that in our bones. Right? We know which are the oil towns and which aren't. But we don't know Bethsaida, Bethany, Capernaum, and Nazareth and Sepphoris. We don't know those in our bones. So when we read the story, we read it with information that's 2,000, we're removed by 2,000 years. So we have to go back there. I mean, imagine someone reading a novel 2,000 years from now about our time. They wouldn't get eagle means America, bear means Russia. They wouldn't get Silicon Valley means technology. There would have to be little annotations like in English class that would sort of catch them up with the different locations. So all I did in my book is to just take into account what we know about the economies of these different places into account when we hear Jesus talking about economics there.
Jerry, if I can just really emphasize that point, because when I read your book, and again, as I mentioned, it's an excellent book. What struck me was, you start to look at the nuances of the area, the area Jesus is from, the areas he goes to. And of course, when you explain it as you have, it sounds sort of obvious, of course, if we went the difference between, oil country in Texas or Alberta versus Silicon Valley versus Wall Street. But when we think of Jesus's time, I don't think most of us would be attuned to the different microeconomies of the area and why Jesus is maybe shaping what he's saying. So can you just give an example of whether it's Bethlehem or Galilee, like some area, and what the economy consisted of there versus maybe 50 miles down the road?
Well, I think you've asked for a good one. Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem, house of bread. Jesus is born there, and he's put in a manger. And Bethlehem had an industry. It wasn't technology, and it wasn't oil, and it wasn't farming in general. Nazareth was olive oil. Well, what was Bethlehem? What was their industry? Well, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that it was shepherding, because shepherds are prominent in the story, but we're not really getting at the real depth if we just leave it there. In the Midrash, we're told, which is Jewish commentary on the Old Testament, and a lot of it is written within a generation of Jesus, so it's pretty contemporary. We are told that the Pharisees disapproved of the occupation of shepherd because sheep can wander, and they might wander onto someone else's property and eat their grass. Therefore, shepherding, it was impossible to guarantee not being a thief if you were a shepherd. So shepherding was looked down on to some degree. But they had a problem because the central industry of Judea was the temple. And the temple ran on sacrificial animals. I mean, you come and you buy your sacrificial animals, especially lambs, sheep. So they had to breed sheep. So Bethlehem was the town where they bred the sheep that were then sent to Jerusalem to be used in the sacrificial system. So Jesus, the Lamb of God, sacrificed for us, who bears away the sins of the world, was born in a town, the industry of which was the breeding and birthing and growing and exportation of lambs of God who were to be sacrificed in the temple in Jerusalem. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that that there's economics going on there, and if we don't see that economics, we're going to miss a really big part of the story.
Yeah. I remember when you first explained that to me, I thought, wow, that's very, very interesting and insightful. So maybe give a little bit of context to Jesus being a so-called carpenter's son. So maybe provide a bit more detail and nuance to what that would have meant for Jesus growing up to, and developing his skill set to age 30.
Yes, he was a tecton. His foster father, Joseph, was a tecton, and Jesus was a tecton. So he's apprenticed by Joseph. And I mean, there's a lot to that. That's not incidental to the story. It's not like Jesus could have been anything. Jesus could have been anything. And out of all the occupations that God the Father chose for his son, he had him raised in an entrepreneurial builder, skilled artisan household. And I think that's important because that's part of the formation of Jesus. We kind of forget sometimes that, yes, Jesus is God, but he's also man. He had to grow up as a human being, and he grows up into an entrepreneurial culture. I think that also helps us get rid of this idea that it's very trendy in academic circles, and they still haven't gotten over it, despite the fact that the archaeological evidence has all gone against them. Around the 70s and 80s, it became a very common view that Jesus was very poor, that he was from a very poor village, that Galilee was very poor. So then that leads into Jesus as a kind of a first century Che Guevara, and he's leading a peasant revolt. Well, we know that's not true now. All the archaeological remains, including in Nazareth itself, show a not wealthy class, but a upwardly mobile aspirational class, a class that was growing in standard of living. And what the evidence we have about skilled artisans like Jesus and Joseph, they were very highly in demand. Everyone knows about how Herod and Herod Jr., these were builders, which meant that artisans were in high demand. They're building the temple. They did a building boom in Sepphoris, very near to Jesus's home when he was growing up. Sepphoris is walking distance from Nazareth. A little bit longer walking distance is Tiberias. So there was a building boom going on. In fact, Josephus said that Herod actually went out and recruited people who weren't builders to train them as builders because there was such a shortage of builders. So this would have been a fairly affluent class, not top of the line. A wide range. I would say that skilled artisans were somewhere between the 70th and 90th percentile of income in their world. And I'm kind of stretching to push that bottom, line down. It's probably higher than that given how much in demand they were. So we have a Jesus who's from an aspirational class, who is sophisticated, financially sophisticated. He would have grown up around a lot of financial sophistication. We don't have a homeless peasant leading a revolt of homeless peasants against property in general. We have something more like an entrepreneurial class of Galileans. It looks like all but one of Jesus's disciples were Galileans. He tended to draw from the entrepreneurial class and from Galilee. And part of what's going on is a conflict between that mindset and the corrupt state and temple-centered wealth extraction industry that you find in Judea, centered in Jerusalem, centered in the temple.
It's interesting as you're explaining this. What would your response be to the notion that, so Jesus, it seems like he'd be an individual that, skilled, somewhat independent, maybe like an independent professional tradesman, artisan, as you said. And then the disciples, we know, of course, there's fishermen who were among the disciples. So presumably they too were somewhat independent individuals. And so what conclusions could we draw from the fact that these aren't people working for the equivalent of the government, working a 9 to 5 and responding to people's orders, but rather it seems like there's a component of independence, freedom, individual skills.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, let's make a reasonable assumption that Jesus was smart about who he chose, that he had reasons to choose those whom he chose to be his initial disciples. Now, he allows anybody to follow him, but he's forming a core group, right? He's forming an inner circle, which he's then going to work through. They tended to be people with some independence. And I think business people, marketplace people, particularly entrepreneurs, but not exclusively, have a certain amount of freedom and independence and flexibility. I think they also have a certain ability to break from consensus and hierarchy and status, because entrepreneurs and business people are not, I think, very high status in our culture. I think that celebrities are high status, politicians are high status, right? Business people kind of help the world, make the world run, but there's a little bit of disdain. The high places of our culture almost think of business people as, I guess, a necessary evil. They're bourgeois. They're boring, but somebody's got to run these businesses. And so, I mean, it's interesting. Jesus has this encounter with the rich young ruler who's a very high status person. And he's hesitant to leave, although he recognizes something in Jesus, because he's kind of locked in. And I think the higher status you are, the harder it is for you to walk away from that. Whereas entrepreneurs, I think, are a little bit more able to walk away from that. And by the nature of being a business owner, they have more freedom and more flexibility and more agency. So I think Jesus chose wisely in prudential ways. Obviously, he chose them for their spiritual orientation and for their willingness to learn the truth, and follow the scriptures. But there were non-entrepreneurs and non-Galileans who had those characteristics. Right. And yet he still kind of keys in on a certain kind of what one might call independent business person.
So this is a good segue into an issue that you raise in your book about a distinction between the entrepreneurial class and an extractive class. And then, of course, we'll discuss how that relates to Jesus's teachings. But perhaps you can just tease out the difference between the entrepreneurial class and the extractive class.
Yeah, that's a good question. And let's broaden out even beyond entrepreneur. Let's talk about creators of wealth versus extractors of wealth. Because you don't have to be a business owner. You can be a CEO, you can be middle management, you can be a frontline personnel. You can be a janitor. I've been one. You can be a janitor and you're producing wealth, even though you're working for somebody else, because you're cleaning the place up, right? You're shining the floor. That's the creation of value, as opposed to extractive classes. And extractive classes aren't producing things. They're taking things that other people have produced. They can take them through taxation. They can take them through, in the case of the temple, a tithe, which had essentially become a tax because the lawyers kind of figured out a way to make the tithe non-voluntary. So the chief priest actually sent, thugs out with sticks to beat people who hadn't tithed. So if any pastors are listening, that's not a positive example. That's a negative example. You can't beat people for not tithing. So
that
the tithe had been
your takeaway for some people.
That's a takeaway. And it can even be religious manipulation. I think, for instance, the story of the widow's mite is not entirely an inspiring story about her faith. It's also partly an outrageous story about this widow, someone convincing this widow that she ought to give her last penny to the temple elite. So religious manipulation, political extraction, whatever it is, you make something, you sell it to somebody, and then I come in and take some of it. I'm the extractor. I'm the taker. Jesus never attacks makers over wealth. The universal pattern, I can find no exceptions to this, in the gospel text are every time Jesus confronts somebody about wealth, they are in physical proximity to Jerusalem, Judea, geographical proximity, and they are also in occupational and class proximity to the extractive class. You don't have any confrontations with any wealthy person who isn't associated with that. Like his friend Joseph of Arimathea, who Eusebius says was a tin merchant. There's no confrontation with Joseph of Arimathea. There are zero confrontations over wealth in Galilee, even though we know that there was a mansion very near to where Jesus lived, because we've dug up that mansion. There were wealthy people around Jesus, but Sepphoris was a marketplace, a trading place, not, highly extractive. So that's a very important distinction.
So let's say if someone is a wealth creator, based on what you've explained, how does that impact how they should handle their wealth or even view their wealth?
I think what I would want them to do first is to get rid of something. I want them to get rid of the accusation or the implied accusation that if they are a successful wealth creator in the marketplace, that they are presumed guilty of greed until proven innocent. Whereas somebody who's in the political class or the religious hierarchy, those are different for us, but in Second Temple Judaism, they were the same thing. There was no political status without religious status. What the picture you have there is that those who are part of the extractive class are, in essence, kind of presumed guilty, and then they can repent, and then they are kind of absolved of greed. And we have reversed that. So anybody can be greedy. A rich person can be greedy. A poor person can be greedy. An extractor can be greedy. And a maker of wealth can be greedy. But I think it's significant that Jesus is hardest on the extractors. He's not hardest on people based on how wealthy they are or not. He's hardest based on how they got that wealth. That's the pattern. So as someone who's a marketplace person myself, but I'm also an ordained minister, but almost my whole life I wasn't and was a marketplace person. I can tell you the message that comes through, whether consciously or unconsciously, in a lot of the church conversation and the political conversation is a pointing finger of accusation against somebody who's in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And what I would say is that the finger's pointing in the wrong direction.
Well, yeah. So we had a question come in from Don, who's one of our contacts down in Florida, asking about, what are the implications for how wealthy Christians or Christians with, resources should handle that wealth. Well, a lot of the response to that would get back to, do we feel queasy about having wealth? Do we feel guilty? Some people would say, is it even sinful to have too much wealth? What would you say to, someone who wants to be a joyful giver, has created wealth? How should they view their wealth and how to give it away to various causes?
You give it away because you're supposed to be generous, and because you, out of love love for God and love for those who are the beneficiaries of your wealth. You do not give it away to purge yourself from the implied accusation, from the guilt of the implied accusation that being a wealth creator makes you morally suspect. So I think there's a kind of a sense in which you go out there in the marketplace and you earn wealth. And by earning wealth, there's like these debits in your moral account. You've got the wealth, and the wealth is bad. But along comes the politician and says, well, I'll just vote for my policies for me to take the wealth away from you, and you're purged from your guilt. Or the fundraiser or the clergy class can come along and say, well, the money's dirty, give me the money. But it won't make me dirty. You having the money is dirty, but if you give it to me, then it won't, that cleans it, and you yourself are cleaned. You're atoning for the sin of being a wealthy person. Sorry, wrong. You don't have to atone for the sin of being a wealthy person. And that's not why you give. There are much better reasons to give, to help people, to further the kingdom of God. Those are good reasons to give, but you shouldn't do it because somebody has misapplied the story of the rich young ruler to you, making you think that you're automatically guilty if you're wealthy.
So that's a really excellent point, because I know in our audience we have people who are working with nonprofits, and of course we all support nonprofits. So just the final point on that. So for the people who are leaders in nonprofits, you would say their approach should be, in a sense, like a positive, giving is an exercise of stewardship. It's positive. There shouldn't be any implication of, you're basically, you're in the dirty marketplace. Somebody's got to do it. Now you can give it to, good people who can do good things with it.
I couldn't say it better myself. And so I won't try. I mean, I think that's right. There's fundraising's great. It's a very worthy occupation. You just have to do it the right way. You don't talk the widow into giving away her last pfennig. I think we forget so many fundraising stories, about the widow's mite, and we forget that right after that, immediately after that story, Jesus storms out of the temple and predicts it will be destroyed. Right. Jesus says to these religious leaders, you are devourers of widows' houses. Shortly after that, we have a story about a widow giving away her last little bit. She's faithful, but then Jesus angrily denounces the temple and its elite and predicts its destruction. So manipulative fundraising as atonement for wealth creation. You don't need atonement for wealth creation. You need atonement for your sins. Being economically productive is not a sin.
Right. Well, that's a great point. So I want to move on to now, with your nuanced approach to understanding the economics of Jesus's day. I want to look at a couple of passages that we discussed earlier. And I want to mention to everyone listening that now, I didn't know this. Maybe people out there are more biblically astute, but there's the Sermon on the Mount and there's the Sermon on the Plain. When I was reading that in Jerry's book, I thought at first my friend Jerry there must be some major typo. I thought there was only the Sermon on the Mount, but there's actually the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. Maybe you can talk about those two sermons and what the difference is.
Well, I think a lot of people fall into the mistake of thinking that there is only one sermon. And then they say the two accounts contradict one another. Matthew and Luke contradict one another, right? Matthew has a Sermon on the Mount. Luke has a Sermon on the Plain. Well, Luke is trying to do this and Matthew's trying to do that. And, and then other people come along and try to reconcile the accounts when in fact they're different sermons. So one is on a mountain and one is on a plain. And they're to different audiences. And that's where we need to get beyond just like accounting for the alleged contradiction, defending the scriptures, and get deeper into this. And the Sermon on the Plain, which is in Luke's gospel, it's Judeans largely who are attending that. So it's probably in the south, and those from Tyre and Sidon. And those, not to get it too complicated, but essentially the central bank of Jerusalem wasn't in Jerusalem. Rome punished Jerusalem and they said, you're not in control of your own money supply anymore. So, that favor was given to others. So in essence, the audience there are those around the seat of government and some people who have traveled down who are essentially the central bankers for the Judeans. That sermon says, woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full now. And so many people have interpreted that as though it says woe to the rich, but it's not third person. It's second person. It's woe to you rich. It's not woe to all rich people everywhere. It's a woe when the second person pronoun is you, right? So if I'm talking to Rick Goossen and I say you something, I'm talking to Rick Goossen. Or if I'm talking to the audience, I know I'm talking to entrepreneurs and executives. I'm talking to you. I'm not saying something about everyone in general. And Jesus he's better than me at public speaking. He knew who he was talking to. Now, so he is condemning second person, plural pronoun, the ruling class, which was extractive for their wealth. But if you put that, like if you do a harmony of the Gospels, I love that technique. If you put the Sermon on the Mount next to that, which looks like it's more northern, more broad, more in that entrepreneurial region, where you get to the part where he would say, woe to you who are rich, he doesn't say it. He says, you are the salt of the earth. So there's a distinctively different message. Almost all the rest of the sermon is the same, but the variance is economics. Why? Because he's talking to different economic groups. Different how? One is a group of takers, and the other is a group largely of takers, and the other is a group largely of makers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned previously when we chatted that it's not uncommon to think that someone like Jesus, who's a teacher, is in different places and of course would tailor remarks differently depending upon the audience. So there might be, because I think sometimes when people assume it's the same sermon, it's because there's obviously overlap, but that doesn't mean it's the same event. It's actually a similar message being customized for different audiences.
Don't you do that?
Yeah.
You do a lot of speaking, right? And you vary. You host a lot of speakers. In preparation for this, you and I talked about who I would be talking to. So I'm trying to the best of my ability to take into account who I'm talking to. Do we really think Jesus would do less? I of course not. I just think that we don't necessarily have the equipment to understand what he's doing in different places,
right,
because it is not part of the standard Christian education to tell you what Bethany was as opposed to Bethsaida. Or the disciples, they live in Bethany sometimes, they live in Capernaum sometimes. Oh, another contradiction.
Right.
No, not a contradiction. Tax arbitrage. By moving from one city to the other, Peter and Andrew, they were able to cut their taxes. So there's something going on in terms of tax transactions. There's a lot of economics going on. And we just aren't aware of it. And I don't fault people. It's a lot of work. I mean, I did this work. I can tell you it's really hard work. So I don't fault people for doing it. I got obsessed with it. So that's why I did it.
So we have a few more questions coming in, and I'd encourage everyone listening, please pose your questions. I'd like to get as many questions as possible. So there's one question here. I think it's just a bit of a clarification. So Teresa asks, how do you classify charities? Because are all churches extractors only, despite what output the wealth may create for, say, better community, healthy youth activities? So maybe just clarify the nuance around the church or religious leaders and how they handle wealth.
It's a good question. It's a big question. Let me say that Jesus endorsed the idea of church leaders being compensated for their work. So he sent the 12 out, he sent the 70 out. He said, don't take, more than a cloak, don't take your money with you. The laborer is worthy of his hire. So I think Jesus is pretty clearly teaching that a faithful minister is a producer, not an extractor. So Jesus is creating an alternate religious leadership class to the religious leadership class that had gotten intertwined with status, manipulation, and political power. So he's not doing away with leadership. And Jesus is not saying all ministers must be volunteers or all ministries must be volunteers. Quite to the contrary. He's saying that they should be compensated, which was in contrast to a lot of Pharisaical teaching. And the Pharisaical teaching was that rabbis weren't allowed to make money as rabbis, that they had to be pure, right? But then they figured out ways to make money. They figured workarounds to that. And I think Jesus' approach is just so much fresher. It's like, be open. You're going to get paid. You should get paid. Be open about how you're getting paid. And the worker is worthy of his hire. But don't use manipulation. Don't use force, and don't use coercion. Don't use guilt in order to do that. Create cheerful givers. A guilty giver is not a cheerful giver.
Right. So I have a question here from Jack in Ontario, and I'm not sure if there's, let's say, insights based on your book regarding a specific topic, but it relates to social finance. So on the one hand, as Christians, we can be generous in terms of essentially, here's the money, here's a check. But would the Bible say anything, or are there any principles which would apply to the notion of, social ventures or social finance, the donor or giver maybe utilizing their entrepreneurial skills to say, hey, instead of giving money to needy people, let's start a business which will generate profit and jobs and employ them, those types of things.
Yeah. So I think there's probably two categories within that. One is impact investing, which is for profit, but the primary goal is not profit. So it's a for-profit model, but with profit not being the central goal. Another version of that would be what some people call social entrepreneurship, which is in a nonprofit environment usually, but is entrepreneurial in its approach. So what does the Bible say? I mean, there's a fair amount of material about that. I would say that the gleaning principle is very important. The gleaning principle, I think, says to the farmer, when that was almost all businesses were farms, not only do you not have to make as much profit as you possibly can, but God is telling them to set something aside for the poor. And they will, in some sense, they won't maximize profit. But I think what God is saying in the broader sense, this is a big conversation. In the broader sense, I think what God is saying to ancient Israel is, if you obey me, including in areas where it looks like you will be decreasing your wealth, over the long run, all of you will be more prosperous. So if you do debt forgiveness, or if you lend to the poor, or if you allow the poor to glean your fields, they and you will be more prosperous. So there's a kind of a trust exercise in that, because allowing the poor to glean looks like it's a profit decrease. But I think the biblical focus is on growing the pie for everyone. It's not give it away to get rid of it because it's bad, right? And it isn't make as much as you can possibly in the short run, maximize your quarterly return. It's more like obey God and create a general ecosystem and society of growth of all forms: spiritual growth, emotional growth, social capital, and financial capital, and you'll have a healthy society.
Right. So wealth creation can actually be a divinely inspired process, especially for entrepreneurs who are the quintessential wealth creators.
Yes, it's part of that. It's not the only part of it. You have to create social capital. You have to build up spiritual capital, playing them off against one another, which I think is what we do too much. You just care about money. What you really ought to care about is spiritual growth. Well, you know what? Being an entrepreneur can be a spiritual exercise. It is a spiritual exercise. I saw a survey of which kinds of business people pray the most often. Entrepreneurs pray more often than other business people. It's all out there on the line. So it's not unspiritual to be an entrepreneur, but being an entrepreneur isn't enough, right? It's part of an overall shalom picture. This isn't the book. It's part of the overall shalom picture that we get in the Old Testament, which Israel shrinks from. So it's interesting. God says there will be no, if you obey me, I'll bless you and you'll be prosperous. And there will be no more poor among you, he says, if you obey me. This is in Deuteronomy 15. You forgive, you loan to the poor and you forgive their debts. There'll be no more poor among you. And then God says, but there will be poor among you because you're not going to obey what I said. Jesus later on quotes that to Judas. The poor will always be with you. And we think that Jesus is saying poverty is inevitable. And I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 15 when he said to Israel, if you obey me, there won't be any poor among you. But because you won't obey me, there will always be poor among you. It's not a universal statement. It's the pointy end of the stick at the Jerusalem elite that because they didn't obey the debt forgiveness laws, they had a poverty problem. They didn't have to have a poverty problem.
Do you think that perhaps an outmoded view of how the Bible and Jesus view wealth is still rooted in an Old Testament view of the economy as a zero-sum equation that, in the old economy, there was no wealth creation. Basically, if you had more, you took it from someone. So do you think the way Christians might approach the notion of wealth is rooted in principles which maybe are eclipsed by Christ's teaching?
I would say I would tweak that a little. I wouldn't say the problem is the Old Testament view. I think the Old Testament does give us an abundance mindset. Just work hard, be wise, worship God above all, be generous with the poor, and together you'll tend to prosper. I think that's the Old Testament message. Then the prophets come along and say, you didn't listen, and you're exploiting the poor using government power. Jesus comes along and basically says, it's even worse than it was when the previous prophets were here. You didn't listen, you're exploiting the poor rather than growing the pie for everyone. So where did the church go wrong? I think the contrast is not between Old and New Testament, same God. I think the contrast is between the biblical view and the pagan view. So you go back and you read Hesiod's Theogony, right? Or you read, Aristotle's Economics. It's a zero-sum game, right? So biblical economics is a growth picture. You can do better and I can do better. We can both do better if we do it right. The pagan view was you got wealthy by conquering. So I think what happens is the early church essentially brings pagan philosophy in, including pagan economics. And for about 1,000 years, we're stuck on pagan economics, which is a zero-sum game, and the church is against capital markets. And then what happens with the Protestant Reformation and even some Catholic thought, there's a rediscovery of the growth mindset that if we're doing business the right way, we can both benefit. And that basically, that point in history is when the world takes off. And to a situation where the poorest in the world are better off than the richest in the world were 300 years ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we have switching gears a little bit, we have a question in here, which is quite intriguing. This notion of extractors of wealth. So let's say you're a Christian in an organization and you're the CEO, or let's say you're the pastor of a large church. And we know in Western business culture over the last few decades, the salaries of the people at the top has has grown astronomically compared to maybe other cultures. So what would be a Christian approach towards viewing the salaries of leaders that might seem actually extractive?
Well, the question is it extractive, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not extractive if it hits some magically high ratio, or some ratio that's higher than historic means. So there's a lot of great quantitative work done on this. My friend Alex Edmonds, professor at London Business School, has done some great work on this, that in general, the gap between CEO pay and frontline personnel pay is more a function of the growth of the size of the company, meaning more responsibility. So just because some CEO has 300 times the salary of a line personnel and another CEO has 100 times, that's low resolution thinking. I mean, let's say you're the CEO of a Dollar General, right? A chain like Dollar General. Well, it's going to be really hard for you to get down there, to the point to like a reasonable, like an average ratio to the people who are, let's face it, in starter jobs, right? But maybe on the other hand, you're the CEO of an engineering firm where the starter jobs are really high pay starter jobs, right? Or you're the CEO of Goldman Sachs and most of your employees are vice presidents and they're really, high income people. So to like compare all of them to one another is really apples to oranges comparison. Yeah. I'd say instead, what I do even as an investor is to look at, is their pay commensurate with their value creation? Rather than arbitrarily saying that the average CEO pay was this times, many times, such and such, and now the average CEO pay is this many times. That's really too broad. We got to do the hard work and get in and figure out, did they earn it? Did they actually do something of value? There is a lot of extractive stuff going on. A lot of my quantitative analysis is figuring out who's extractive and who's into, really producing something. But it's not a simple, how high is the CEO's pay or how high is the CEO's pay compared to line personnel?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have around 13 minutes left. So just to let everyone know, if you have questions, definitely pose them. I'll include however many we have time for. There are a couple of key points I wanted to just get Jerry to address. So there's the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And for all of you listening, I'm sure you're familiar with it to some degree, but Jerry, could you just summarize the parable and then explain what you see as some of the key insights?
Well, the parable is about a man named Lazarus, and he's very poor, and he lays at the door, or in some of the translations, he's laying at the door, at the porch or the gate, poulos in Greek, of a rich man. And the rich man is there, and he's wearing purple and fine linen, and he feasts daily, morning and evening or afternoon, by the lamp, lampos, literally. He celebrates. He has feastly celebrations. And they both die, and Lazarus goes to be in Abraham's bosom, a place of blessedness, and the rich man goes to a place of suffering. And Lazarus and the rich man says, Abraham, I'm thirsty. This is terrible. Send Lazarus, to give me water. And Abraham says that can't be done. There's a gulf fixed between us. And then the rich man says, well, at least can you send somebody to warn my 5 brothers in my father's house about this? And Abraham says, they have the law and the prophets. If they don't listen to that, they won't listen even if somebody is raised from the dead. So this is one of these parables that I feel like is often weaponized against people who are in the marketplace, by political people and by religious hierarchies. The problem is there are some really telling details. Remember, details matter about this story that indicate that the rich man is not generic rich man, let alone business executive or entrepreneur, but that the rich man is in fact the high priest. What? I never heard that before. Well, it didn't start with me. I found it in an obscure church father from the 4th century. So, I didn't stumble across this idea myself. Maybe it was forgotten because it was useful to forget it in some ways. It was useful for medieval religious hierarchies to basically have a weapon to use against wealthy people. But what are the details? He wears purple and fine linen. In the Greek text of the Gospels, those are exactly the same words that are used for the garments that are worn by the high priest, as described in the book of Exodus, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is written almost completely in Hebrew. Some parts are Aramaic, but rabbis created a Greek translation. And that Greek translation was quoted often by Jesus and the apostles, so they were aware of it. So we can look at a Greek word in the New Testament and then say, oh, we'll go back to the Septuagint, to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and get some idea what it meant. So the purple, the fine linen, the celebration is the same as used for religious celebrations in the Septuagint. By lamp, he celebrates, it's joyfully by day, by lampos. Well, we have lamps in the temple. So all of these linguistic things kind of line up. Lazarus is put at his portico. I mentioned before, that's a poulos. In the New Testament, that's used to describe Solomon's porch at the temple, that same word. It's also used in the book of Acts to describe one of the pagan temples, the porch of the pagan temple. This is Templar language. And I think people there would have picked up on that. Finally, to me, the clincher for this was that Caiaphas was the high priest. Caiaphas had 5 brothers. We're told that by Josephus. He married into the priestly family of Annas or Ananus, both names are used, who had 5 sons. So when Caiaphas joins in, when he marries in, he's got 5 brothers. I searched Josephus and Philo, the other literature. I can't find any other reference in any contemporary historians to 5 brothers other than the 5 brothers of the high priest. This is the high priest that we're talking about. He presided over an economically extractive temple, and he's the one who was failing to care for Lazarus. And let's not forget, there was a real Lazarus too. We've got a fictional Lazarus in the story, who's talking about rising from the dead. And then we have an actual real Lazarus in the gospel accounts who does rise from the dead, right? And it's so fascinating the way these two stories interact. Lazarus was from Bethany. What was the industry in Bethany? It was being poor. Bethany was poor town. So Lazarus, Mary, Martha, they live in poor town. It's right there close to Jerusalem. It's in some sense on the porch of the temple. Lazarus rises from the dead, and not only do they not believe, but Caiaphas, who's the one being pointed at in this parable, is the one who, in response to the rising of Lazarus from the dead, says, we need to kill Lazarus and we need to kill Jesus. Right. So there's just too many coincidences here to ignore.
Right. So it's not a wealth creator or wealthy person generally. There's a specific nuance to this passage.
Yes, and if you're kind of aware of circumstances there, it ain't subtle. It's a 2x4, especially with the 5 brothers. Right. Nobody there would say, 5 brothers? Isn't that interesting? It's who has 5 brothers? Right. Oh, the one who wears purple and fine linen and dines by lamp, and who does not take care of the poor of Bethany who are on his doorstep.
So believe it or not, we have about 6 minutes left, but I have one specific question I want to ask. I just want to remind everyone that we will have a survey as soon as we're done in 5-6 minutes now. And then we are giving away 5 copies of Jerry's book. So once you fill out the survey, we'll pick 5 individuals at random, and then we'll mail you the book. So Jerry, I want to ask one question because I found it quite interesting when you explained to me previously, and I think it'd be of interest to everyone. So, of course, we all know about Jesus's throwing out of the money changers, the money lenders. Maybe just explain some of the nuances that are rarely covered in that story. Maybe just give a quick summary, what's going on, and then there's a few things you point out that are quite interesting.
Well, what's going on, again, let's go back to that Septuagint. If you go back and you look at the money changer function in the Septuagint, there's a temple tax, right? So you take your money and you have to give in the temple shekel. Well, if you look at the value of the temple shekel that's there in Exodus, and then you compare the value of the temple shekel that we have in the New Testament, we find out that the price of the temple shekel has doubled relative to pagan money. We have that in the story of when Jesus is asked about the temple tax. You know, that story where he sends Peter and Peter gets a coin out of the mouth of the fish. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's not just a coin, it's a stater. And if you look at the details, he's paying double, right? Why is he paying double? Because everyone paid double, because they had a crooked exchange rate. The exchange rate was changed in a way that everybody had to pay double. So it's almost like, here's a scenario, like imagine you went to church and there's an ATM machine. And in order to give to the Lord, you had to change your pagan money for Christian money at the ATM machine. You could only use the Christian money when you went to church, right? And let's say that in order to get $20 of Christian money, you had to exchange $40 of pagan money. That's the picture, pretty much. So it's highly extractive and highly exploitative. A lot of people say, no, it's not about economics, it's about whatever. Well, you got some problems. One is Jesus calls it a den of robbers, which is suggesting that it's robbing, right? The other thing is he singles out the dove merchants in 3 of the gospel accounts. Why single out the dove merchants? What's different about the dove merchants than all the other animal merchants? The offering of the dove was the offering for the working class and the poor. So the dove merchants were more extractive and exploitative by nature of who they were dealing with their 100% markup than were the other groups. If I tax a rich person at a certain rate and I tax a poor person the same amount, that's a regressive tax, right? It's harder on the poor, even if it's the same amount, right? So this is harder on the poor, which explains this really, again, details matter. Why does Jesus single out the dove merchants? Because there's no theological distinction. There's an economic distinction. They're the ones who are most economically extractive.
Well, those are a number of excellent insights over this past hour. We just have a couple minutes left. So I just wanted to ask you if you had maybe a wrap-up comment or two for all the people listening in terms of here's from a Christian standpoint, maybe how to approach, wealth creation versus extraction. Any, closing comment for everyone?
I'd say the closing comment is kind of more, it's less about application and it's more upstream. It is, we have to be open to a Jesus who surprises us. And we have to move away from the idea of taking our best thinking and hanging it on Jesus or the Bible. And this book has been very well received, but when it hasn't been well received, it's because people already had decided what Jesus meant, emotionally invested themselves. Now, some people have emotionally invested themselves in a Jesus wants you to be rich, and some have emotionally invested themselves in a Jesus wants you to be poor. They've invested themselves in some message, right? Mm-hmm. And our job is not to tell Jesus what Jesus is allowed to tell us. Our job is to let Jesus speak, and he's allowed to say new things to us in light of new scholarship. So what I think, again, the book's been well received, but when it hasn't been, it's because people think they already know what Jesus was saying. And what I'm saying is, if you look carefully, if you read the text very carefully, Jesus' encounter with the rich young man, and Jesus says, do not defraud, when he lists the 10 commandments, even though do not defraud is not one of the 10 commandments. All those little details, all those place names, if you let the Bible speak, you find a Jesus who is shocking, and we shouldn't turn that down. And I feel like some people on the left want to turn Jesus up to quarter volume, so he sounds a little socialist, and then use that as a weapon. And other people say, he sounds too socialist, turn it down. He's just talking about your heart, or he's just talking about the second coming. It's just spiritual. And I say, no, turn it up. to full volume and listen carefully. And what you're going to get is surprising and shocking and insightful. And Jesus's money story is so much better than our money story.
Yeah. That's great. That's a great note on which to conclude this hour-long interview. Jerry, really appreciated all your insights.